We're going to go to Professor Bruno Cautrès, who's a researcher at the CNRS and joined the Center for Political Research at Sciences Po in 2006. His research consists of work on the analysis of political behavior and attitudes, and Bruno Cautrès has participated in various different French and European research projects on political participation and on voting and elections. Professor Cautrès, please, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much for the Hong Kong Baptist University and from to Professor Alistair Cole also for the invitation to join this fascinating panel. So what I'm going to talk about is going to give you the main findings of a very recent survey that we have done at Sciences Po, which is a comparative study between France, UK, Germany, and Italy about the reactions of the citizens towards the pandemic. So let me share my screen with you first. So basically speaking, let me first explain what it is exactly, that study. That study is actually part of a bigger research program that we have at Sciences Po, particularly in my team, which is called CEVIPOF. We are developing an annual study. That annual study, we started to do it in 2009. So it is 12, 13 years that we are doing that annual survey. And it is an annual survey about trust, confidence, and attitudes of the French to democracy, to the political system, and to the political institutions. Since last year, we decided to move and to do it and to replicate the study in different European countries. We did it on last year, France, Germany, and UK, and we have replicated this year France, Germany, UK, plus Italy. So the study was done 2 times in the pandemic times. On the last year, we did it in April, and on this year, we did it in January, and we have just replicated it in the beginnings of May. So this is actually national representative samples of the sample size, about 2,000 individuals in each country, and we are doing the same data protocol with about the same questionnaire and about the same research design in the different countries. Basically speaking, the big research question is the following. The pandemic, with particularly the massive state intervention, particularly in a country like France, is like a quasi-experiment to test for the following. It is like a massive injection of trust, normally, where the citizen normally should have a unique experience that in a short period of time, the authorities are reacting to support, to care, and actually to play their main function, which is to protect the citizens. So actually, it would be like a massive injection of normally trust. And what is extraordinary is that it's a massive injection of trust in situation where in the different countries, but particularly France, the level of trust in politics, the level of trust in government is extremely low. So do we have or not an effect of the pandemic on the level of trust of the citizens toward the authorities and the institution, and broadly speaking, our politics? Before talking about political trust or before talking about institutional trust, let me present to you some data about the state of the minds of the Europeans in the pandemic. We are asking them, what is your first feeling on today about your situation? Is it serenity? Is it fatigue, morosity, well-being, confidence, distrust, fear, enthusiasm? As you can see on the different countries, what is very spectacular is going to be the very high level of, particularly if you look to to the green arrows. The green arrows indicates to you the raising figures since the last year. You could see that everywhere, lassitude, in other words, fatigue, and morosity are going up, but particularly in France, where the state of the mind of the people is predominantly negative one. Fatigue, morosity. We have some national variation, obviously, but broadly speaking, we can say that there is a large state of fatigue across the European populations after a year of pandemic, with big variation, but particularly the biggest variation is going to be France versus the rest of the other countries, despite the massive investment of the French authorities in the pandemic, and particularly the economic measures decided by Emmanuel Macron. You may need to remember that in the beginnings of the pandemic, Emmanuel Macron said, whatever the cost, so whatever the cost doesn't translate into optimism in the populations. We also investigate a classical set of indicators and measures about social trust. We could say also that the pandemic is also a unique experience of trust or distrust in the others. Trust, because in the beginnings, particularly of the pandemic, there was a lot maybe of solidarity, people helping each other, people doing things to protect the others, but also distrust, because you have to have a certain social and physical distance to the other people. So also it is very interesting to look to the pandemic, looking to social trust, and we could see that you should be very careful actually when you have a relationship with the others. Okay, on average over the 4 countries, it's nearly 60%, particularly high in France and in Italy. And during the pandemic, we doesn't really change also this, which is that the level of social trust is much lower in France and Italy than in Germany and in the UK also. This is another indicator of social trust, which is basically speaking, telling the same story. Satisfaction with life, particularly interesting in the case of France, because France has the reputation to be the country of distrust in politics, low level of social trust, but on the other side, happiness, and particularly happiness in life. So what is the level of happiness in life after more than a year of pandemic across the 4 countries? We could see that satisfaction with life is not very high over the 4 countries, and particularly low in France and in Italy, much higher in Germany, and also in the UK. What about the level of life, the standard of living? Do people consider that their socioeconomic situation has improved, has been stable, or get worse? Okay, look, what is very interesting, if you take the case of France, okay, the dominant opinion is that the level of living get worse since the beginning of the pandemic, but with a negative evolution if we are comparing to the last year. So it looks that in the French public, there would be eventually an effect of the economic measures, and we will see that later. What about trust now in institutions? Because, as we said, the pandemic is a unique experience to get support, to get care from the authorities. So what about trust in the institutions? If we are looking to trust in the government, this is something super interesting. You could see that it's not the government which has intervened the most in the economic side, on the economic side of the pandemic, which is trusted the the highest. The level of trust in French governance is only 35, when in Germany it is 57, so with a gigantic gap between the two, but also in the UK, which is much better than in France. And you could see regularly in my data, you could see regularly something which is looking like similarities between France and Italy, with Germany and the UK getting closer to each other compared to France and to Italy. What is super interesting is also the level of trust in the EU. The level of trust in the EU is getting highest in France, in Germany, and in Italy also. So eventually we could say that the economic measures decided at the European level could have an effect on the trust in the European Union. But if not, what is also very interesting is that you could see a classical result that the local authorities get more trust than the national one, particularly the government. Okay, if you are not talking about the government, but you are talking about the prime minister, the current prime minister, you can see, basically speaking, the same kind of results. The functioning of democracy over the four countries also. This is the dissatisfaction with the functioning of democracy in the four countries. So how much people are not satisfied with the functioning of democracy in the four countries? It is very, very, very high in France, even if it is getting lower, but it is very high in France still, and also in Italy. And again, we could see a big difference between France and Italy on one side, Germany and the UK the other side. So basically speaking, we are getting the same story, which is that despite big economic accompaniment of the crisis in France, the level of satisfaction with democracy, the level of trust in the institutions, the level of social trust, the level of satisfaction with life, the general mood of the population is not so good in France with, if we are comparing France to the other countries. This is also a set of measures looking to which public and private institutions do citizens trust in. Medical staff, science, scientists, obviously very high with the hospitals also in all the four countries. In all the four countries, you will find, basically speaking, about the same story with some slight national variation, obviously, but basically speaking, the story is that in the context of pandemic, public institutions receive more trust than political institutions. Public institutions, particularly dealing with caring and protecting the citizens. Not only science, not only the hospitals, but also police, army, school, social security. At the bottom, you will find everything which is concerning the public space. The political parties, very low trust. The trade unions, very low, particularly in France, much higher in Germany, UK, but very low in France. The media, the social networks also. So anything which is concerning the political sphere is receiving much, much, much less trust than the public institutions, particularly the public institution caring or perceived like close to the citizens. What about trust in politics, particularly? No longer trust in the institution, but trust in politics. We are asking the respondents, what is your main feeling when you think about politics? Distrust as number one, disgust as number two across the four countries, interest, boredom, hope, respect, fear, enthusiasm. Particularly in France, where distrust and disgust are the main feelings of the population, but also you could see that in the UK, distrust also is very high. In Germany also, but the specificity of France is that the most negative words are the most cited when French think about politics. And again, we have this French paradox, which is that despite the massive economic accompaniment of the crisis, people do not feel hope, enthusiasm, or respect for politics. This is a set of other measures. Do you consider that people care about the ordinary citizens? Sorry. This is yes, they do care about the ordinary citizens. And this is they don't care about the ordinary citizen. And we find again the classical result in most of the countries that ordinary citizens do not consider that politics and the politicians particularly care about themselves, particularly in France, particularly in Italy. What are the feelings? We believe that a crisis like the pandemic is likely to generate a set of emotions in the public. And we decided to measure 3 emotions that political psychology consider as the very interesting ones: fear, anger, and hope. It's a scale from 0 to 10. And at the top of the slide, you have the averages across the 4 countries, the average in France, in Germany, in the UK, and in Italy. So we could see that fear is a major concern in the 4 countries, where it's the highest means. But when you look to anger, anger is particularly strong in France and in Italy, 2 countries where the far right is actually very an important political force. We know from other studies that the voters of the far right in France, the voters of the Rassemblement National, of Marine Le Pen, are particularly have the feeling of a big anger against the system. And again, we see that despite the massive intervention of the public authorities in France, it doesn't make anger or fear to get down. It's very stable since the last year, actually. What do they think about the probity of politicians? Are they honest or corrupted? It's quite huge in Italy and in France. Okay, so you see it's still the same story, that France and Italy particularly have a very, very public perception, very negative of politics and of the politicians. What about political systems now?
Just a few more minutes, please, Professor Cautrès.
Yes, I'm going to conclude. What about the political system, and what about the potential reforms of political system? We have 2 sets of indicators. Basically speaking, the survey document the findings that we call the critical citizen thesis. The dominant feeling is that democracy and representative democracy is still the best form of political system, but we have many tensions below that. The main tensions are that in the 4 countries, but particularly France and Italy, there is a demand for authority. It's not because of the pandemic. It is something that we have before the pandemic, but particularly in the pandemic. There is a demand for authority. Last year, you've got 15% of the French saying that army running the country could be a good solution for France. It's now 20%. The second thing is that the role of civil society, we were just talking before, we were just talking about NGOs and civil society actions in the UK. And we have quasi the same thing in my survey, which is that there is a big demand for a better association of civic society and also direct democracy to get better government and better management of the crisis. Finally, let me conclude on this. We have asked the respondents if they feel the government is doing well in the management of the crisis. Okay. Do they feel that government is doing well? This is yes, I do agree. Government is doing well. Only 37 in France, 56 in Germany, 48 in the UK, 52 in Italy. I would conclude on the following. What makes the French situation very interesting and very unique? I'm not saying so because I'm French and you know that French always explain to you that France is unique and these kind of things. No. What makes the French situation compared to other countries very interesting is the following. The massive shock of the pandemic and the massive shock of government intervention doesn't translate in a massive shock of trust. It is certainly the case that in some European countries, France particularly, the stock of distrust pre-existing before the crisis is so big that it doesn't really change anything. We have replicated that study in the beginnings of May. I just received the most recent data, and the most recent data are showing the following. If the French executive Emmanuel Macron is positively evaluated on the economic side, on the management of the crisis, for the rest of the management of the crisis, it is extremely negative, extremely negative. One last word. In the field of explaining political attitudes of the citizen, we know that we have perceptive filters. Perceptive filters are there, obviously, depending on the social backgrounds of the respondent, depending their partisan affiliations. Obviously, all of that is going to vary. But what is even more interesting is the following. In the beginnings of the pandemic, more than a year ago, the messy situation in many European countries, France particularly, on where are the masks, what is happening, why this mess? Because in the beginning it was very messy. Stop and go in the government decision doesn't create something very good for the governments. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Is there a quick question for Professor Cautrès? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Cautrès. I just have a quick question regarding the last thing you have said about the authority, higher demand in authority, but at the same time, a higher demand in a civil society and direct democracy. Isn't it a contradiction?
It looks like potentially a contradiction. I don't see that it is likely that we would need more detailed items in the survey because people are not asking authority and direct democracy for the same things. What is absolutely sure is that you have a general negative evaluation of the functioning of democratic authorities in the pandemic in my country, in France. And particularly on the logistics management. The vaccination has been a mess in the beginning in France. It is much, much better now. The distribution of masks also in the beginning was absolutely messy. So many citizens have probably get from that it would have been a good idea to ask the army to organize vaccination. We have other studies that are showing that many French would have agreed on that management solution to ask the army to organize that. Okay. But on the other side, you have a longer trend, even before the pandemic, which is that associating directly citizens, associating more directly civil society to decision making in France is really a general, it's a general trend. After the Yellow Vest crisis, obviously, there was this big demand of a better direct democracy, referendum, popular initiative referendum, particularly. We've got that big national debate organized by Emmanuel Macron after the Yellow Vest crisis. So you have a longer trend in asking for more civil society to make better governance in France.
Professor Cabestan, please.
Thank you, Professor Cautrès, for this fascinating presentation. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that distrust in France pre-existed COVID. But you haven't mentioned a dimension which is very much in the mind of many French people today, the idea of decline, that the French is in a declining trend. How did it reflected? Did you ask that specific question to in your survey, and how did it reflect in your survey results? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, it's yes, particularly in the recent waves of the survey that we received just a few days ago, we have asked many items about the feeling of decline, and particularly the French meritocracy. It is probably the negative evaluation of politics in France is probably very linked to the feeling that the French meritocracy doesn't work any longer, that the French system doesn't distribute the promise of equality. And you know that equality in France is a very important keyword. And there is a very, very negative evaluation. In other words, we have asked people, do you consider that you cannot achieve in France if you don't know people, if you have not networks, in other words? So yes, there is that feeling of decline, which is there in France. And also, particularly, the question of meritocracy. And I consider that it is probably what is the key explanation for the next year election in France, with a big opposition between two responses. The Macron responses, which is to renovate what is equality, no longer egalitarianism, but equity, reforming the French social protection model to cover new inequalities, versus the Marine Le Pen model, which is national welfare and sovereignty. So I am expecting that the next year presidential election in France is going to be a big confrontation on that question, probably. In the beginnings of the pandemic last year, the book that was the best seller on French Amazon was actually the book of the French historian Marc Bloch, wrote in 1940, The Strange Defeat. And you cannot imagine how much in my country the evocation of the disaster of May 1940 has been there in the beginnings of the crisis. In the beginnings of the crisis, with the incapacity of the French authorities to distribute masks, the discover that the French health system was under an amazing pressure, because before the crisis, most of the French believe that they have the best hospital system of the world. So it was constantly evocated a year ago that it was like a replication of historical trauma for France, particularly the defeat of May 40, particularly. So that feeling of France losing its capacity to be a powerful country is there in the country. And it probably explains the potential success of Marine Le Pen in the next presidential election.
Professor
if,
Coates, I think
yes,
we'll stop there if you don't mind.
yes, sorry, I've been too long. Sorry.
That's okay. So we will move on now to a presentation by Professor Alistair Cole and Dr. Dionysios Stivas, both from the Hong Kong Baptist University. Title is Trust, Transparency and Transdisciplinarity, Lessons from COVID-19. And Professor Alistair Cole, of course, needs no introduction, but we'll get to one nonetheless. He's the head of the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's published extensively, mainly in the field of French, British and European politics, and he's worked in the UK and France in addition to Hong Kong. Dr. Stivas Dionysios is a research associate at the Government and International Studies Department of this university. He is the founder of the idea of meta-secularization, and his research interests include international security and securitization, trust, transparency, and European integration. Please.
Thank you very much. Okay, trust, transparency, and transnational lessons from COVID-19. This is it's a thing. It's a thing we've been working on for about a year or so now. It started off really with a seminar series with Jean-Pierre Cabestan in particular that we ran last year, about a year ago, and I guess that's what gave really made us think to do the conference today, but also to think about these questions of trust, transparency, and transnational lessons from COVID-19. And of course, many people are involved in this conference. I'm not going to talk to everybody here. Just give a quick rundown of our paper. This is a paper that's doing the rounds, as they say. It's almost there, but it's doing the rounds, so there's still room for a bit of improvement. Now, what we'll be doing here today, just as a brief summary, will be the paper. We compare modes of health crisis management in 4 distinct jurisdictions: China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the UK. And the key idea, in a way, is to consider how varying trust transparency mixes provide a guide for understanding the public governance of the COVID-19 pandemic. In short, trust, particularly trust in government, we argue, is vital for controlling the virus in the immediate sense. And I'll come back to a point made by Bruno there, because it's a powerful finding, whereas transparency is arguably the condition for a longer term resilient and sustainable policy response. However, we argue that trust and transparency cannot be considered in the same ways in our different types of system. It's clear that when we talk about trust and transparency in our 4 cases, the signification for those concepts varies somewhat. So in a sense, we're using trust and transparency to get involved in a most different comparison, really, of 4 approaches to the health pandemic. And I'll come back to that later, but I'll now hand over to you, Dion.
Thank you very much. So I will speak a little bit about the overview of the cases and the methodology. It is not connected. Can you hear me now? It's on? Yes. Okay. So as Professor Cole mentioned, we focus on institutional trust, on political trust, on transparency and capacity. There are different modes of trust, transparency and capacity, and Professor Cole will enlighten you about this in a few minutes. But we try to see how these three different variables affect the public management of the COVID-19 crisis. There's limited academic research on these aspects of the pandemic's control, at least last June when we started to write this paper. Last June also, we chose these 4 case studies, UK, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, because they were all these 4 peculiar in some way. If we would commence this study this year and now, we would probably choose different case studies, but this paper is based on this particular administrations. We follow a most different comparison case study analysis because all of them are different in terms of geographical location, in terms of values, in terms of political system, population, neighboring countries, and many other things that can affect how a country responds, controls, or contains a pandemic, COVID-19 in the particular case. So as you can see in this graph, there is the research design graph, we have trust, we check trust, transparency, and capacity in order to find out how successful was the public management of the COVID-19 crisis in these 4 different jurisdictions. We form and we work on 4 different hypotheses. The first one has to do with trust. We assume that during pandemics, trust is a key explanatory variable, a key determinant that explains how efficient the public management of the COVID-19 crisis is within a jurisdiction. And we focus on political trust in particular. We also form a hypothesis, speculation about transparency, is it still on? Yes. And we claim that it's an essential predictor of political trust in pluralistic liberal democracies, but not so much in authoritarian regimes or semi-authoritarian regimes. Within the overarching framework of state capacity, when we focus on capacity, we assume that the early advantage lies with authoritarian regimes. They have more capacity than liberal democracies because they can mobilize fast and effectively vast resources to manage crises. But liberal democracies also face some challenges of legitimacy, especially if they opt to respond to the pandemic like authoritarian regimes do. In the form of health securitization. Health securitization is much easier to be performed by authoritarian regimes than by liberal democracies, as you probably all have noticed throughout this 1.5 years. People in liberal democracies, they do not respond very well to kind of authoritarian practice and strict lockdowns. Now, in terms of methodology, probably ask how we measure trust, capacity, and transparency. To measure trust, we take into account public surveys, publicly available, especially those from Edelman, YouGov, and PORI. PORI, especially in Hong Kong, is very useful. They measure trust every 15 days, I think, the trust to government. And we consider the classification of Edelman in order to classify trust above 60% as trust, between 50 and 59% as neutral, and below 49 as distrust. 4 different modes of capacity: coordination capacity, analytical capacity, regulatory and delivery capacity. We do not have enough space to focus on this, but we link capacity to public governments to a certain extent. There is also any official measurement in the literature about transparency, so we make one of our own measurement of transparency. We evaluate the existence, methods, and frequency of official communications about the pandemic, who is making these communications in the relevant administrations, who makes the announcement, and we consider also if there is a possibility for the citizens to be involved in the decisions that affect their life during the pandemic, to measure the effectiveness of the administrations to counter the pandemic. We look into the numbers of cases and deaths caused by the COVID-19. So now we'll pass it.
Let me say, yeah, thanks. We're having a bit of a ding dong show here, so I'm coming back again now. Trust, transparency, and capacity. Just really to sort of to put into context a bit these three concepts. They're all extraordinarily elastic concepts. They're very difficult to pin down, and I think as became apparent in the presentation of Bruno Cautrès, it's clear that if we're talking about individual trust or social trust or collective trust, we're not talking about exactly the same thing. That goes without saying in a way, but the argument that we have, and again, the paper with Julian, is in a sense that interpersonal, social, and collective trust can be mutually reinforcing. They can reinforce each other in a pandemic. So in a sense, the basic argument we have in our paper is that trust in government, in a slightly normative sense in a way, but trust in government is actually important, because if trust in government is not forthcoming in a pandemic, then it's clear that the society is not going to behave in the way that governors might expect of it. And I'm just thinking back again to Bruno's comments on Macron, really, and the French context, and how in a sense the pandemic's been managed in France. And I think in a way, one of the points of trust in government is a consistent legitimizing discourse. So it's in a sense, the public discourse needs really to be consistent. It needs to tell a good story, but it needs to tell it consistently. It's very difficult to do, of course, but that in a sense is about trust. So we're mainly looking at trust in government. If we can move on a bit, transparency. Can we move on to the next one? Yeah, transparency, just very briefly. Transparency is another enormously complex concept, as I think Paul Cheney, who's still online, hopefully would agree. He got me into all of this. But basically, it's clear that if we take David Heald's classic view, there are different types of transparency. And I really like this idea of 4 dimensions of transparency. Vertical transparency, essentially, vertical transparency when an organization has hierarchical oversight over another person or an organization. Upward transparency when the superior can observe the subordinate. Downward transparency, that's a form of accountability of rulers to the rules. And horizontal transparency, which is all about the information available in relation to organizations. Now, these 4 types of transparency, in a way, link in rather different ways with the argument about trust. And they also actually allow us to distinguish between our countries. Because we might say that one of the difficulties that Boris Johnson had, for example, in the UK, although not the only one, far from it, was that in a way, at the end of the day, it's clear that the public was demanding, a degree of transparency about decisions, and that some of the decisions taken by the advisors around the Prime Minister were extremely contestable and helped to sort of plummet the overall amount of trust, hence capacity in facing the pandemic. So, so these dimensions of transparency play themselves out in rather different ways in our different cases. And if we move on to our third sort of concept, really, it's that literature on governance, capacity, and crisis management. And it's huge, it's complex, I won't go into it too much, but very, very nice piece by Pierre Lagrade and Reike last year, talking about 4 different types of capacity in a crisis management. Coordination capacity, bringing together disparate organizations to engage in joint action. Analytical capacity, that's analyzing information and providing professional advice. Regulatory capacity, control, surveillance, oversight, and auditing. And delivery capacity, how to handle the crisis, exercise power, and provide public services. And those 4 different dimensions of governance capacity link in our article, at least, to our what we call trust transparency mixes and how they play themselves out in the different countries. Back to you, Jan.
Yes, thank you. And I will show you the findings from these 4 different case studies, starting with mainland China. And in this graph, you can see transparency with light green thick line. There's no transparency as such in mainland China. Like in other countries, the government is not very transparent. We have measured transparency, trust, and the number of cases of and deaths until January 2021. So they're not updated up to today, but you can see in terms of trust, it was very high already from February 2020. It was 90%, highest in the world. It fell to, it went to 95% in May 2020, but it fell to 82% in January 2021. Some weeks ago, Edelman published the new results. Surprisingly, now it's even lower. It's 72%, the trust in government in China is going lower, although the government is doing apparently well in handling the crisis. Now the deaths and the cases, yes, as you can see in the graph, and as you know, they were very high at the first 2-3 months of the pandemic, but then they stabilized. They rarely have any death or case anymore in mainland China. Now in the UK, more transparent. The government published, it was very open on how it was dealing with the crisis. Various ministers were making public announcements very regularly in the UK, informing the people about the situation. They have a website where you can find all the relevant statistics and information. So it looks very transparent how the government deals with the crisis there. Trust in government, it was around 50% at the beginning of before the virus appeared within the borders of the UK. Around February 2020, it went up to 68%, but then it started to decline. Trust to government decline until January 2021. It was around 40%. At the moment, it's 62%. Again, it rises up. Not surprisingly, the UK has done better than many other European countries with vaccinating most of its population and having very limited number of deaths and cases nowadays. As you can see, the other graphs, the deaths and the cases, they were not. The situation was not very good in the UK until January of this year. In Taiwan, Taiwan was also very transparent. They even had a website where people could be involved in decision making about the measures that the government will take. Surveillance was very high, like in mainland China, but they didn't have to last week many cases or deaths, as you know. And trust to government was also almost above 80%. Now in Hong Kong, successful similarly to China and Taiwan, not many cases, not many deaths, but the brown line is the trust to government. It goes from below 20% up to 20, 26, 27% maximum. Very, very low distrust to the government. Although the government looks very transparent in how it deals with the pandemic. There is, you probably all know, there is a website where everybody can find all relevant information, daily briefings from the ministers. It looks very, very transparent. Cases and deaths, more or less, you know about it. But not better than Taiwan, but still much better than the rest of the world. I will pass the floor to Professor Cole to tell you to conclude.
Okay, I'll be very, very brief because I'm conscious of the fact we're moving on very, very slowly, actually. But I think in a sense, discussions and conclusions. I mean, the easiest conclusion would be to say, well, there isn't a conclusion actually, because this is clearly extraordinarily complex. But I think there are nice variations. And I think while redoing this paper, I actually I went a bit over the top and got into notions of gouvernementalité or governmentality, as Foucault would say. And I think in a way, it's quite, I'm not going to go there too much today, but it is clear that I think in a sense, we see that these are 4 different cases have really rather different modes, if you like, of governmentality or governing, if you like. But what we see across, common strands coming across, we see, and this backs up what Bruno Cautrès was saying, clearly trust in health experts appears to be extremely strong. I mean, the UK case shows that in actual fact, trust in medical experts is not, the experts themselves can be divided, of course. And this is one of the points of the debate, particularly in the more, let's say, open countries, that medical expertise has been contested. And I think that that's an important point. And it's also the case that it's part of the transparency of this whole process, that in a sense, the medical expertise can come out fully into the public domain, which is in itself a way of distinguishing, I think, between cases. Then we conclude the article by saying that there are different forms of state and governance capacity, and each one of these forms of state and government capacity has a rather different mix between trust and transparency, and has a rather different balance between direction of resources and broad analytical capacity. There are clearly some advantages in a tightly organized authoritarian type response. There are disadvantages in that response in other contexts, but it's clearly the case that there are no easy fits either. And we'll finish with Hong Kong because we're here. In a sense, you could say that Hong Kong demonstrates quite high levels of governance capacity, at least in terms of its analytical capacity, in terms of the relative low numbers of deaths and so on. But there is this problem. I better be careful what I say, but there is this. There is the question of trust in government in public surveys. I think the UK is interesting because the UK, a very fluctuating capacity and legitimacy, appears to dive to the depths really at certain points in time. And I think Paul Cheney's paper was extremely interesting because it demonstrates, of course, there are 4 different responses in the United Kingdom. It's not just one response in the UK. I mean, and clearly you couldn't get into Wales from England. I'm not sure whether you still can do now. I'm not sure exactly what the latest thing, but in a sense, so the UK it's got 4 territorial varieties of territorial welfare, if you like, as Paul said. But it's also, its legitimacy is perhaps more fluctuating by comparison to performance in areas like delivery of vaccines.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left.
That's okay. I think we'll finish.
Lovely, wonderful. In that case, we will move on to our final paper, which is The Impact of COVID-19 on Electoral Democracies, a Global Comparison and Lessons Learnt. And our speaker is Dr. Kenneth Chan, who is an Associate Professor in Political Science at Hong Kong Baptist University. His research interests include the political economy of the European Union and comparative politics of post-communist Central Europe. From 2012 until 2016, Kenneth was an elected member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, representing the Hong Kong Island geographical constituency. He was also the chairman of the Hong Kong Civic Party. Please, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much indeed for having me this afternoon, or good morning to friends joining us across Europe, very early hours in the morning indeed. The topic of my presentation concerns the performance of electoral democracies amid the COVID-19 pandemic. I would tap into the global perspective, summing up findings from elections that took place in 2020, but also gathering lessons as well. The objectives of the presentation is threefold: to understand the impact of the pandemic on elections in general and democracies in particular. Pandemic democracy, the second very important topic. Basically, political scientists in general and also activists in the pro-democracy movements over the world have been wondering how democracies behave amid the pandemic, by which not only about the regime type, but also about ordinary people, voters, politicians, leaders, governments, and so on and so forth. The big question asked again and again, to postpone or not to postpone elections amid the pandemic. Now, we don't have to look very far actually in Hong Kong. The chief executive decided to postpone the Legislative Council election last summer for no less than 1 year. But there are other, of course, decisions or other patterns of decision to be explored as well. Last but not least, be that as it may, we're still living in the pandemic. It might be going, but we don't know when, how fast. So what measures or strategies there might be in terms of risk management throughout the electoral cycle, not just on the voting day, but throughout the whole process, from preparation, legislation, preparation, the polling day, the counting, the announcements of results, and so on. The postponement paradox is a very interesting concept. Again, to postpone or not to postpone, of course, most governments are really placed between the rock and a hard place indeed. Whether or not during the pandemic, holding elections would indeed promise a level playing field for all contenders, would debates or campaigns be too risky to take place? Because at the end of the day, we are very familiar now with the face masks, with the social distancing, and the lockdowns. Holding elections might be defeating the purpose of keeping people apart, because these events would tend to bring people together, and there might, of course, a new wave of health hazards. Would voters' preference be changed when the attention has been really very much focusing on the pandemic, the deaths, the risks, the dramas, rather than the issues, the policies, or performance of individual politicians and parties? Of course, together with the pandemic, we also have the infodemic caused by misinformation, fake news. Many of them are produced and utilized by, of course, politicians taking advantage of the pandemic. A bit of political opportunism and cynicism and authoritarian populism has been fueled as well, and bringing down the level of democracy, and of course, new questions and challenges to the degree of electoral integrity as we have known it. The turnout might be dampened because of the pandemic, for fear of catching it. Would contenders normally in elections would think that, well, because it's not going to be fair, because of the social distancing, because of lockdowns, because the government of the day has new powers to prevent people from doing normal things, they might feel like boycotting the elections altogether, and therefore, logically, the turnout would be lowered. There might also be controversies, even very serious contention, leading to violence before, during, and after elections. Last but not least, and going back to the theme that we've got a lot, many times I would say this afternoon, we're talking about trust, we're talking about transparency, we're also talking about legitimacy. The overall effectiveness of governments during the pandemic would be very much negatively affected, deepening mistrust and so on. In general, a lot of people will rely on think tanks. This is one of the best performing, in my view. International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance for some sort of very general ideas to start restricting the service. We noticed that at the beginning of the pandemic, many democratic governments decided to put elections on hold due to the increasing degree of uncertainty. However, as time passed, more and more governments decided that it's time to really hold elections come what may. So many of the countries still would like to hold elections within 2020. In terms of turnout levels, we have, for example, according to IDEA, 30 countries reported increase in turnout, mean increase by 7.7%, whereas in 41 countries, they experienced a decline in turnout with the mean decrease by 10.4%. Now, we got all these data in general terms from international think tanks such as IDEA, but here based at Hong Kong Baptist University, our department I have initiated the Hong Kong Election Observation Project. As a project basically homegrown, but we are very interested in global trends as well as lessons for local application. We have been able to track 129 national elections and 20 national level referendums held in 2020. The state of play, as you can see that, at the end of the day, by the end of 2020, there were 98 elections and referendums held, accounting for 66% as originally scheduled. Of course, 50 elections or referendums were postponed, accounting for 34%, but at the end of the day, they also got done by the end of the year, with only about 12 of those national elections and referendums still pending. So at the end of the day, basically you can see looking around the world, the global picture, 92% of those elections that were supposed to take place within the pandemic did take place. It's very challenging to governments, to incumbents. 5 of the 15 presidents seeking re-election failed to do so. And in terms of parliamentary elections or parliamentary democracies, in 15 elections, the incumbents won more or kept the same share of seats, whereas in 10 elections, the incumbents won more votes than the last election, meaning the rest basically suffered as a result of the pandemic. 3 research questions came to mind: the extent to which COVID-19 pandemic was aggravated by the elections, because it's one of the arguments put forward by the chief executive of Hong Kong, Mrs. Carrie Lam herself, says that it's too dangerous to hold elections. Second question, factors affecting turnout. To what extent COVID itself was indeed a very damaging factor, undermining turnout, deterring people from going to the polling stations. Last but not least, what factors affect changes in turnout? Let's take a look at the overall turnout, 60.9%, and the turnout is higher in elections than referendums. And in 85 national elections served, turnout increased in 34 cases. The average value by 6.1%, whereas in 51 cases, turnout declined. Mean value by the mean value by 7.9%. But the average change of turnout basically experienced a very mild, very slight decrease, minus 2.3% between 2 elections. State of play, if you look at the global picture, dividing elections in terms of the regional distribution, you see that interestingly, in Africa, they experience a pretty strong increase of turnout between elections, whereas most other countries or most other countries in other regions experience decline. In terms of regime type, very interestingly, among those 3 regimes gets categorized by Freedom House scores, those are electoral democracies, the turnout became stronger amid the pandemic. Whereas in partially free or unfree regimes, the turnout plummeted, especially among the countries categorized by the Freedom House scores as unfree. I try to sort of run a few statistical analysis or bidding models when I'm going through the data set myself, and therefore gather together not only the level of turnout across the region, but also the performance of government in terms of responding to the pandemic, health expenditure, number of cases before 14 days, before and 14 days after the polling day, the degree of change in terms of COVID incidents, and then also electoral violence and boycott. In other words, I'm trying to bring together more conventional political science variables and concepts together with the pandemic to see to what extent turnout, to what extent changes, and so on have been affected by all these factors combined together. Likewise, not only I run statistics according to the regional distribution of elections in 2020, but also in terms of the regime types as well, according to the Freedom House score. As you can see that, for example, in this case, we have under 35 countries observed as free polities and with 53 elections and referendums held, and you see pretty strong performance on the basis of the indicators included in the analysis. It's a little small there, I'm sorry about that. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint later on. It's my technical, one of my technical problems, I have to admit, I have to own up. But basically, if you ask me whether by holding elections would aggravate, would make it worse, the answer is in the negative. According to this particular statistical model, after gathering data from around the world, not at all. If you think that the larger the turnout, the more serious the situation will become, which is not true. This model shows just the opposite. The increase of turnout basically did not lead to the aggravation as many politicians or governments had wondered. Reason being, if you take into consideration other factors such as government response, social distancing or other measures in place, or alternative voting methods introduced during the pandemic in response to fear that voters would be deterred or participation would be declining. These measures actually turned out to be pretty supportive and helpful in terms of propping up the level of inclusivity or inclusiveness in participation. Of course, there are also other factors such as government spending as a percentage of GDP on healthcare, and also the degree of confrontations between political parties and contenders as well. So literally, according to this model, what's interesting and important to notice that turnout itself wasn't a factor really leading to the worsening situation in different parts of the world. Basically, it's a health issue, and it's an infectious disease, as a matter of fact, and spreading around. Elections, when managed properly with all the mitigation measures in place, basically was not contributing to the pandemic. The second model looks at turnout, whether the pandemic indeed deterred voters at all. Yeah, in a way, but very slightly. So 14 days before the polling day, when the news got really, really bad, some people might decide to stay home instead of going to the poll. But again, you can see that the direction is really negative, inversely related. Yes, indeed, but also with a very slight impact. But traditional political values or variables such as election violence, election boycott, they were more powerful protectors on turnout. Here you can see boycott, for example, when, for example, the contenders felt that elections were not going to be fair, transparent, reasonable, they might initiate a boycott. If they were successful, meaning the supporters agreed with the leaders not to take part, then of course the turnout would be lower as a result. In terms of election violence, it's interesting. You can see the negative sign over there. It seems to me that free from violence or free from confrontation would not encourage turnout. But contentious elections with a degree of not only protests, but confrontation, maybe even violent protests and violent confrontation between contenders would drive the turnout higher, would drive it up. Last but not least, looking at the degree of change of turnout between two elections. Again, you see the pandemic itself did perform or did have a negative impact on the turnout between elections. But again, the degree is very mild. And when compared to other indicators such as government issues, government policies or responses in terms of restricting internal movement, then the turnout level would be lowered to a larger degree. And also we can bring back election violence, electoral boycott to look at the situation again. And you can see that more conventional, traditional, political variables did have a stronger impact than the pandemic itself, according to all these three models. Okay, very briefly, moving on. One big question is a normative one, whether or not we are witnessing backsliding or democratic backsliding during the pandemic. Thank you very much. 5 minutes, notice that. According to IDEA and also Freedom House, nearly half of the democracies we have in the world have regressed on basic rights with emergency measures to combat COVID-19. There have been reports of state-led oppression against democracy movements. Many of them are in this part of the world, in Asia. Abuse of executive powers, undermining the rule of law, even changing the rules of the game amid the pandemic, changing the electoral systems, for example, as we are witnessing in the case of Hong Kong. And last but not least, also new measures to obstruct, disrupt election observation missions internationally as well as domestically. All these factors basically would come together to sort of a point of direction that during the pandemic, autocrats, authoritarian regimes would take advantage of the crisis to further undermine civil liberties and leading to, of course, eventually democratic backsliding, not just among democracies, but many hybrid authoritarian or dictatorial regimes. This is indeed the case. If you look at the chart here, globally comparing the Freedom House score between 2 years, 2020 scores, looking at, of course, 2019, and then 2021, looking at 2020, it's like, a decline of the freedom scores globally. But in terms of regime type, you notice that hybrid regimes and autocratic regimes recorded actually sharper drop of the freedom scores during the pandemic. Whereas across the regions in the world, the Americans and New Zealand and Australians, they're doing better, improving the performance. Whereas across Europe, there have been slight decline of the Freedom House score. Well, by and large, I would say that many of the assumptions about democratic backsliding, about the risk of holding elections during the pandemic, didn't turn out to be true according to the statistical findings that we managed to gather and present to you today. Elections can indeed be credible, can indeed proceed with integrity. It depends on what governments do and how the stakeholders respond. I mentioned already special voting arrangements. We've been able to collect information and policy measures from all these interesting cases. One I would like to also emphasize, for example, just for fun, the Czech Republic introduced drive-through polling. You can basically drive through, just like taking fast food from McDonald's and Burger King. You can also drive through and vote accordingly. But of course, there are also special arrangements for people suffering from the disease or people being ordered to be placed under quarantine to continue to exercise their right to vote as well. So at the end of the day, it's all about publicity, better communication, consensus building, and capacity building. Political factors, administrative factors are more important than COVID-19 pandemic itself, explaining performance of elections and also performance of democratic leadership around the world. No place for complacency, however. Very briefly, James mentioned about organizational elephant traps. That might be due to inaction, arrogance, inability to learn, and therefore would increase the level of risks, political risks, causing leadership deficits, coordination deficits, and implementation deficits as well. As far as we are concerned, I mean Hong Kong, are concerned, I'm afraid we have yet to really understand systematically the lessons gathered from around the world for 2020. I'm afraid we are basically doing all the wrong things as we proceed to prepare for the upcoming elections. At the end of the day, speaking on behalf of the Election Observation Project, of course, I would also like to emphasize the importance of the values provided by international and local election observers and audits, helping the government and the voters to develop the trust and the degree of consensus on how to hold free, fair, democratic, but also healthy and safe elections. Thank you very much for your kind attention.